Hi, welcome back to the Active Listener. My name's Mark Julian, and here we plan to listen, not just hear. Today, we've got a special guest named John Fisher, and we're going to be talking today about cultural change. So, welcome, John.
Thank you very much for the invite and welcome, Mark Julian. I'm looking forward to this.
Me too, and I understand that you specialise in cultural change. We were talking just now, you are a bit of a celeb in the coaching world as well, but I won't embarrass you anymore. So would you like to explain a little bit about yourself, give us a bit of background before we move on any further?
Yes, thank you, Mark Julian. Background is a bit of a different background in many ways. I started my working life doing an air radar electronic apprenticeship in the Royal Air Force, and then spent a few years working on aircraft radar systems, radio systems, and aircraft simulators as an engineer. Basically, I did a craft apprenticeship, but never quite felt comfortable. And was always more interested in what makes people tick than what makes aircraft radar systems tick. So did an Open University psychology degree that introduced me to an American psychologist who created something called personal construct theory and published his magnus opus back in the mid-50s. Around a very individualistic approach to people. And it was almost as if the scales fell from my eyes. I felt Kelly had written my life. And he was talking about, and this is my interpretation, it was talking about we're all different, and even when we share an experience, we will interpret it differently. And when we use a word, it means what we mean it to use, which may be different to yours. So one of the examples I regularly use, just to maybe bring that to life, is if I use the word introvert or the word extrovert, then in popular sort of culture, they have a wide variety of meanings. And for some people, extrovert is life and soul of the party, outgoing, gregarious. For other people, an extrovert is somebody who's noisy, in your face, always talking. And of course, introverts, we have the deep thinkers, the people who prefer one or two really deep colleagues rather than a lot of friends. But for other people, an introvert might be quiet, shy. For goodness sake, speak up, don't be a wallflower. So they then filter how we perceive the world and the sort of things that's got an implication for in how we then react. And that led me into doing some counselling training. It led me into working with people, really, and then going into an internal consultancy, into a training partner, leadership and development training, coaching, where I've sort of stopped working 20 odd years ago when I just found my niche in that whole interpersonal development field, and loving it, really enjoying it. So that's a brief nutshell about my past, my history, and that career change that I think has given me a bit of an interesting perspective, coming from what could be called a hard process driven structural into it's more about the grey areas. And one of the expressions I use a lot in the coaching with some people is about, I really am comfortable with ambiguity, and I'm comfortable with just not knowing. And that then I think helps me then understand the other person clearer, because it's about listening to what they say. It's about listening to how they then use their language and exploring what they mean. So for me, coaching's a conversation. It's a joint exploration. I don't have the answers. The coach, he has the answers. And unlike some of the other talking therapies, where it's the interpreter that has the answers. Within constructivism, the interpreter is the individual interpreting themselves for the benefit of the therapist, the coach, and for the benefit of themselves. Words I use a lot, so apologies, Mark, Julian, but does that make sense?
It does, and I definitely get the feeling, the vibe there, that you have a genuine interest in people, both in how they think and what they value, but also in terms of wanting what's best for them. And today we're going to talk about cultural change, and I think as we've sort of 3 years on from the beginning of the COVID pandemic, there has been a lot of change in society and on an individual level, where people have maybe reflected when they've been forced to work from home or not work at all, and been reflecting on what's life about, is the job for me. And so there's been an individual basis, but of course there have been companies that have merged, there's companies that fallen by the wayside, and we're in the future, things are always progressing. So cultures change, and I'm interested particularly about your views in terms of how do you manage cultural change, whether it be an existing organisation that is going through a different direction, whether it's true to change of leadership, or where we've got these mergers of three different companies coming together. How do you navigate cultural change, and what has your role been in all of that? Huge question. That's not
massive question. And if anybody gets the answer, they'll be multimillionaires. Just to give some context, Mark, Julian. So I suppose to give a very trite answer to that, how do I approach that carefully? It is laden with emotional content. I think one of the comments I came up with a few years ago when I was sort of looking at change and putting together some change awareness type of sessions and did Kotter's training on the iceberg theory and that leading bolt change elements. But a quote by Sir John Harvey Jones, who for a long time was head of ICI, probably 80s and 90s. And he said, when he's looking at organisational change, it happens one person at a time. And I really like that, because for me, that goes to the heart of constructivist sort of philosophy, and you can only change it one person at a time. You do need the classic tipping point, and once you've got other people, it becomes the norm, and then people are more likely to do it than not. So it's about, for me, it's about engagement. It's about engaging the people and giving them a bit of a understanding of that whole situation and understanding of what and where people are and how that sort of impacts on them. And I've got a short model here, which, if I may just share with you, this is something I sort of put together a few years ago now, and I think it just sort of gives a bit of context. And this is about a change timeline. And as with any sort of timeline, the past, present and the future are fundamental in what we do and how we do it. So if we look at the past, we've got to give people a reason. So the burning platform, in inverted commas, why should they change? What will they get from the change? But also, you've got to recognise what was good about the past, what worked, what did they do for within the old world that maybe they'll lose, and I'll tap into that in a minute. But you've also got to close it down, the American concept of closure, and you've got to compartmentalise it to then allow you to create that future vision that's a really strong vision of what the future is. So what will people be doing? What will they be saying? How, where will they be doing it, saying it? So give them sort of that specific and create that really compelling, big hairy goal that there is there. And what that then allows you to do is give them the route map on how are they going to get from the past to the future. What are the steps? What support do they want? Do they need? What support is available there, to give them that clear sort of overarching, overall comprehensive understanding of what it is they've got to do and how they've got to do it. And my experience is people, organisations tend to do 2 or 3 of them really well, but don't quite get that effective change. So maybe get compliance more than commitment and that buy-in to change. So what could happen is, if we don't close the past off and give people the reason, Simon Sinek's begin with the why type of concept. So if you don't give them that reason to change, chances are they'll have lots of Zoom sessions, coffee chat sessions, whinge sessions. Used to be so good in the past. Why do we need to change? This really worked well, and just lose sight of the argument, and hence become more resistant and become more hesitant to change, which means the change takes longer. And what I've sort of found and noticed in a lot of organisations is that then length of change tends to be underestimated by management and the leaders of the organisation, and they sort of think it will happen really quickly and either get tired of it, don't get the quick hits and the low-hanging fruit consistently, so decide to change again. And you then end up in that constant change scenario, rather than allowing the change to embed and to become more successful.
And I guess, sorry to interrupt, I guess
No.
then you have the risk of then having multiple cultures, because you've got, I mean, there's various things that could be going on here. You have a company that's decided to go in a different direction, change of leadership, for example. And so we're deciding we're going from an old way of doing things to a new way of doing things. And you maybe bring on new people, but you've got the original staff, and there's already this sort of grating between the old and new culture. We're trying to bring something in.
Yeah.
You may have a merger where you've got people with 2 different cultures coming together, and how do you navigate that without one feeling they're being taken over by the other and going to something new? So we've got this new direction we want to go into, but we're all kind of got our foot in the path because we know where we are already. We may not love that, but then the fact you've now got to go somewhere new, you become entrenched, and we look back and think, oh, it was amazing, where actually reality before the whatever announcement, they were probably moaning about that, or we were all moaning about it. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on there, and it seems to me too, there's something feeding into about what do we have control over, because if you haven't got buy-in, it's just being done to you, and then why would you be part of this culture? Because you have no choice, right?
Yeah, definitely. And spot on there, Mark, Julian, with that. And personal experience, a company I worked for some years ago, and that really led to the change timeline that I put together. They effectively outsourced virtually all of their HR into a joint venture new company that they put together with an asset management person who'd left the financial industry and persuaded the company I was in to do that. And the new company really managed it really well. And we were engaged every week. We got updates, we got briefs, there was workshops that were held to bring us all together. We were sold that vision. The people who stayed in the parent organisation, and we adopted the Meister model. So we had the key points of contact in each organisation, and then in our organisation we had the supporting teams that provided the back office specialist support. But the people who stayed in the parent company didn't get anything. They were just expected, because nothing was changing for them apart from the whole world losing friends and everything. And so there was resistance, and I was fortunate to be doing my master's at the time in organisational psychology. So I did a longitudinal study as my dissertation, looking at both the stayers and the leavers on their perception of HR, the organisation in the past, in the present and in the future. And I then went back a year into the new company and basically repeated the exercise. And what I found was that the people who were being tupied into the new company all had a really clear vision of what HR was going to be like. And they also had a clear and very strong correlation between perfect HR and HR in a year's time has been almost identical, the same thing, the same concept and everything. And when I went back a year later and did the same exercise, they still had a close correlation, not as close, but a close correlation between perfect HR and HR in a year. I think it had dropped from 0.9 to 0.75, so really strong correlations. But what they'd done, because they weren't at perfect HR a year in, they moved the goalposts further backwards and perceived themselves to have travelled a long way, but they started behind where they were. So almost that cognitive dissonance effect in we're not here yet, so we must have had further to travel than we thought. And a lot of resistance, as I say, which I suppose, if I may share something else, just brings me on to something else that really came out of a conversation I had with Tom Ravenette, who was a educational psychologist some years ago, around a 4-box model, a Boston box type model on the impact and the outcome of change. So if people think it's going to have a big impact, then they will either be not looking forward to it or looking forward to it. And the top line there, if they anticipate it's going to be negative, then they'll be resistant, they'll be less likely to do anything. Whereas if they think it's going to be positive, they're going to be for it, they're going to be a champion. If they think the impact is going to be minimal and they can't see it being very good, that then takes them into the head in the sand, the why is this happening to me, what's on earth the point, and maybe end up with people who leave either mentally or physically. And you're usually better off with the physical leavers. And those who maybe think it will be positive, but don't think there's going to be much of an impact, sort of think it's going to be a drain, it's going to be tiring, they're going to put a lot of effort in for not much reward, and they're just going to be on the treadmill type. And I suppose that the classic Office with Ricky Gervais in it, with the good news and bad news, falls right into this category, as well as the really highlighting the different perceptions, where he calls the team together, good news, bad news. The good news is I've been promoted, the bad news is you're all redundant. And they're all going, where's the good news? What's the good news in this? He says, well, I've been promoted. And that for me epitomises sort of this anticipation of change, as well as that different perspectives that people bring into the situation. And that sort of leads us into linking back into another one of the change types and the change behaviours around the followers will be passive but won't actively block it. The activators, the lions, the champions, the blockers, the cynics sometimes called, that will actually try and force it to try and force you to change your mind, try and show that the old ways of doing it are the ways that work and the best ways that work, and that take you into having to spend a lot of time going over things, telling them more than once. And it goes back to that engagement. If you engage from the start, if you let them have a voice and be part of the discussions, even though you might not be able to do what they want, the fact that they've been heard, the fact that they've got into a conversation about what it is, what's happening and what's going on, and can see the bigger picture. And my experience, a lot of people, whether they are big picture or detail, in times of change need the bigger picture and need to be able to fit it into that big why, as it were.
So the other thing that strikes me about this is that there's definitely this real issue of trust, because we've got this thing of okay, you say to me it's not being done to me, so you're engaging with me, but can I trust you? And particularly someone's maybe long, I don't understand, if someone's older, and I count myself in that category, been around, in industry for a while, and you've seen changes come and go, whether it's to the same company or others, it is easy to become cynical, or become entrenched in the way of doing things. So how do you navigate that as someone who's proposing change and saying, look, everyone, this is a good thing?
Yeah.
How do you build trust without people feeling, oh, you're just box ticking, you're listening to me, but you've already got a plan because you've changed the leadership and this is where we're going? How do you deal with that in an authentic way rather than propaganda, for example?
You like asking the easy questions, don't you?
Absolutely.
Julian? Yeah. Don't make it hard for me. Give me the good, gentle ones to wind me in. I think, and this is where I'm maybe more of an outlier than some of the standard models, because I do come from that individualistic perspective. So you've got to do it one person at a time, one step at a time. Now, that's not to say you can't have group sessions and do some group coaching, group future planning type of work, but it's got to be done and tap into that emotional. NLP have a saying, sell the sizzle, not the sausage. So you've got to sell the what's in it for me syndrome, and personally, I believe what's in it for me, and because are two of the most powerful change levers that you can have. You've got to get them to see the benefits. And I go back to that, the 4-box model about approaches to change. You've got to get them to work out what their own personal positive outcome is that they can then buy in, get behind. So the future visioning things where people can plan out and have some sort of communication with the future, and where they can talk about how they perceive it, how they see it. And I'll share 2 models, if I may, that that for me have been very powerful. One of them is by somebody called Finn Schude, who came up with this model that he calls the ABC model, for it looks like no real reason apart from there's 3 elements to it. But it's about, and you might recognize this, those of us who've been around a while, as force field analysis, Lewin's model. But what's the desired situation? What's the current situation? You articulate those. You then look at the argument for change. So what's wrong with the current situation? What's negative about it? What's stopping us? What's the values of the desired situation? What will we get? What are the advantages of that? And my experience, a lot of change stays at that level. They sort of argue the burning platform. They don't look at closing the past down, celebrating the successes from the past and what worked. And what Finn talked about was, well, there are another element to that. So what's positive about the current situation? What is it that we get out of it that's good? And what will we lose in the desired situation, what will give us more work, maybe more learning, new systems, new people. Excuse me. And at the start of COVID and start of lockdown, as you alluded to, one of the companies I was delivering training into sent all of their call centres home to work from home and faced a backlash a little bit in that negative emotional impact. And so they brought people in to do some coaching and gave their employees some free coaching to help them adjust. And while some people loved working from home, other people hated it and wanted that social interaction, didn't have the right venues. So a lot of negatives there, lost the friends, and if they lived alone, and some of the things we found in COVID with people living in tower blocks who weren't allowed out, and all of that social isolation that came from it, with the sad implications and impacts on people's mental health, and all of those areas were having that impact. So it's looking at that level there about what are we going to lose that we like, that we want, and maybe showing my generation now, friends, and Jennifer Aniston's character, when everybody went out for a cigarette because she felt she was missing out, she used to go out with them because she didn't like them all leaving her. And that for me is an example of this bottom line. So I've used this in group sessions, I've used this in big workshops as well as on one-on-one levels, and got people just to brainstorm everything that goes in those boxes. I've sometimes got them to score and to give a value to each of the statements that they've put, and then got them to look at what do they need to do to feel comfortable about overcoming that blocker, or what needs to happen to remove that blocker, to allow them to take some ownership in what they want to plan, how they want to plan things, and to move it round from compliance to commitment and that lip service. Now, this is not easy. It takes persistence, and it takes sort of congruency within the senior leaders in walking the talk, doing what they say, both in private and in public. And those of us with long memories may remember where Gerald Ratner famously made a comment. Yeah, I can see you remember. Famously made the comment in what he thought was private that ruined his empire and closed his business down because he had a different personal opinion to professional opinion, and that didn't quite gel with the public. So here we go. And this came out of some of the counselling work I was doing, where people were having a really good initial session, going away on a high, and then not coming back for the next appointment. And I started thinking about why, and the perception, the impact. And the reason I brought this up after Finn's ABC model is, for me, this sort of explains that. And what it is down that slope is, it's about a sudden realization of the reality. So while you enthuse them and engage them in the initial session, when the cold light of day comes in and they realise they've got to change their workplace, they've got to change their friends, survivor guilt, I think, has a bigger impact than people do give it credit for as part of this, so needs to be part of that change action plan.
So you mean in the context of Survivor, if there's been a takeover, people have lost their jobs and you've retained your job and other your friends have gone?
Yeah. Very much so. Yeah. Or you've been moved to a new job, and your friends have gone and the job's gone, and that might be what you like. So and it's about that. So you go down that slippery slope that's then around your sense of self-identity and your sense of self-worth, self-value within it, that goes then back down to the bottom of it, about that real identity crisis. And I used to call the bottom bit depression. But I didn't want it confused with clinical depression or with anything like that. So I changed it to that confusion, and it's that I don't know which way to go. I don't know where to go, the brain fog and everything. And then I sort of added insight, because sometimes when you hit rock bottom, you suddenly see a light, you suddenly get a realization, you start taking control and make it work, and by that engagement involvement. And I've used this on the floor with people in workshops and got them walking it and got them looking straight across from one place on that left-hand slope to where they are on the upward slope, and get them walking that in a timelining way to look at the skills and everything they need. But I then realised, and I based this on a variation of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's bereavement curve, because I just made that a sort of logical step for a little Yorkshire Dales lad, that any change is a loss. So you were in bereavement, but it's a different one to that emotional family friend type loss. So it was about that impact on sense of identity. And as you sort of go through this, you need to support people, give them that engagement, give them that visibility, etc., to allow them to make that dip as light as possible. But I realised that it wasn't that simple again, and that there are different reactions people have. So I added in a couple of 3 other ones here from Kubler-Ross's that she doesn't cover. And the hostility, I'm using hostility there in a high energy against something. So the saboteur, the cynic, that's doing everything they can to prove you're an idiot for making me change and forcing this on me, to at the other end, denial is low energy, head in the sand. I'm just going to keep low and hope you've forgot me and ignore me as part and parcel of it. And then I added the disillusionment one in, because I realised there's been times in my working life when I've just decided the organisation and I are just drifting further apart, and we see this in people, sadly, relationships, friendships, marriage, partnerships, etc. Eventually the what is it, in musical groups and bands, you get the classic, we've split up through musical differences, and that's just, I'm going. My values, I'm not prepared to compromise them to fit in with yours, so I'm going somewhere, and again, hopefully physically rather than mentally, because you then end up with a massive other problem. Branson's quote about, what if I change people and they go? And Branson's response, what if I don't change them and they stay? It's that type of concept, to give them those skills and everything. So for me, this has been really a key influence in how I see change, and how you can apply this at a group level, a team level, natural work team, or just individuals. And I've run open workshops literally using this, where people talk about their personal change, what they're doing, what they can do, link it in with Finn's ABC to start getting them to hone down on those action steps to get to that big, vibrant, visible future.
It reminds me actually of a conversation I had with Rachel Morris regarding the Shapes toolkit that she champions developing. One of them being this whole thing about the zone of power. Very simple exercise. You draw the circle. What do I have influence over? What I don't. It kind of correlates with what you've. I mean, yours is much more advanced, and some. But the principle is the same there. What, recognizing the situation. What can I control? What can't I control?
Yeah.
And then you're in a position to be able to make a decision. Well, actually, is this right for me? Is it right for me to stay, or have our values been crossed? That it is right for me to move on. I know that you've got some really interesting stuff to unpack regarding approaches in coaching.
So my theory on change, and I wrote a little bit of a work booklet on Smashwords calling Putting the I into Change, because I love plays on words and puns. So it's about putting the individual into change and making that as the focus. So it's going to be about how we as individuals see the world, about what we can do to explore above and beyond what Finn talks about with his ABC model, and looking at a few little tools and techniques that we can use in group sessions or in individual and one-to-one sessions.
Brilliant. And this is the regarding constructionist coaching.
It is constructivist coaching. Yep, it's a philosophy for life for me, because it's all about the other person.
Brilliant. Well, look, John, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to speaking to you soon for part 2.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark, Julian, for the invite, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and hopefully you and all of your listeners will find something to challenge me on, to integrate, to comment on, and I look forward to seeing some of the comments against the videos and challenges and questions.
That's great. Thank you, John.